Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast. I'm Jim Henson, director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. Glad to be joined today by Josh Blank, research director of the Texas Politics Project and veteran of the UT Texas Politics Project poll, among other things. Josh, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
A little extra embellishment today.
Yeah, no, that's nice. I like it. A little flair.
Holiday season, a little
very
more
generous.
A little more flair.
Generosity.
A couple extra ornaments, some tinsel.
I need it, trust me.
I need some tinsel. I need a little tinsel.
Definitely.
Well, here we are. The clock is running out on the fourth special session as we record this on Thursday, the last day of November.
Yeah.
And for that matter, on the year. And it's been quite a legislative year, which we'll kind of get to. I don't think we're quite here for – this isn't quite like the year-end wrap-up, but it's
getting there.
It's getting there. So it seems – it seems today what we want to do is, take stock of where the legislature is as we transition into primary election season. And I think, that transition is very literal. We were talking in the office before this, and clearly primary season has started.
Right.
And though, despite all the signs to the contrary, the legislative session is not over.
Right.
Seems all but we'll get to that. It's been a couple weeks since we podcasted. We had one that we sort of lost through technical difficulties, just a gremlin in the system.
It was really good, though.
It was great. It was the best. It was the best one.
It would have really cleared up everything for everybody.
So it would have been hailed as revelatory. Unfortunately, no one will ever know.
We know, though.
So, it's good to catch up, and we're going to pursue some of the themes in that podcast. But honestly, it does underline that if you don't do this for a couple weeks, more things happen.
Yeah. For sure.
All things being equal. So since we last recorded a couple of weeks ago, the effort to pass vouchers, which has been, one of the predominant themes in Texas politics for the fall, if not a little longer, it failed. And it failed by an 84-63 vote on, basically it was a vote on an amendment to an omnibus election bill that had a lot of goodies in it that we've talked about. But this was an amendment that stripped the vouchers out. So it was an 84-63 vote with 21 Republicans voting for the amendment. And again, that bill also included things like teacher pay increases, an increase in the per pupil allotment.
Yeah, this was the big
Right.
test to see whether if enough other goodies were put on here, in particular, as you said, increase to the funding formulas,
Right.
increase to teacher pay, increase to school safety. If you put all those things on there, it's, I would say pretty serious levels as far as what the level of discussion around those things
Right.
were. Could you peel people off, of their voucher opposition? The answer was no.
Right. The strategy of at least some of the folks in the pro ESA voucher community, broadly speaking, that I had heard from talking to some folks was that, and this was sort of out in the open, was, this approach. Put together a big bill that made it hard, harder for people to vote against it, presumably.
Mm-hmm.
Get it to conference with this, something comparable in the Senate, and then, negotiate it, essentially use the conference committee as a final, platform for negotiation. Well, that didn't work, or
Right.
at least, it would appear that it is not going to work. And again, the Senate was coming briefly into session today. The House has been out for most of the week, are gaveling in on Friday. To leave ourselves a small caveat / trap door here, something miraculous could happen, but it would be pretty close to miraculous. Now it's the season.
Yeah, we'd say vouchers are it's a season of resurrection.
Yeah, well, no.
No, I'm sorry.
Birth.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, you're showing yourself here, buddy.
I'm from. Yeah, I'm sorry.
I'm of a different tradition.
I'm of a different tradition. It's older.
That
No,
was
but
good.
but it's all but dead. I mean, that's the
Yes.
thing. I mean, to say otherwise. I mean, again, leave ourselves a trap door here, but it's
Right.
hard to imagine without again a
Yeah,
miraculous.
you can leave that holiday commentary in case there's a special session after the primaries.
Sure, but even then,
timing would be about right.
yeah,
So that happened.
right.
Now I want to go back a little bit, and this is this is maybe retreading something that we just wanted to do in the last podcast, but it's relevant. So, where is the governor in all this? Now the governor was pressing very hard for the House to vote on, to move this bill.
Yeah,
And obviously for vouchers to pass. And he's taken a few different tactics on this.
Yeah.
And to be fair to the governor, depending on the timing. So,
Yeah.
Back when he, before the third special session, before he called the third special session or the fourth, he had basically said he was going to give the legislature 2 sessions,
right.
That was essentially going to be the October and the November sessions.
Yeah,
With a little bit of overlap there, or a little bit of running into the following month. And then he'd let the vote, then, he kind of declared dramatically, and then we'll let the voters sort it out.
right.
But he kind of backtracked on that. And and the way I read it, and I think we read it in the now departed podcast, was that, as they began to get a little bit of traction and this bill in the House, it was this omnibus type bill, began to move out with these voucher provisions in it, he increased the pressure somewhat. So
Right.
let's rewind to about 3 weeks ago. And this was on a Friday afternoon about 3 weeks ago when the governor was signing SB 7, which was the COVID bill from the third special. And he seemed to indicate, a preference for putting more pressure on them. So we've got some tape on this thanks to a Twitter post from Ryan Chandler that we drew this audio from. The audio's on the internet. So let's play this excerpt from Governor Abbott's comments at that bill signing.
Pretty much every member of the House has people back home. It could be families, it could be kids, it could be educators who want to see this legislation passed, because this legislation is going to benefit the voters and the residents in each of the House members' districts. But another thing I know about the House, and that they know me well enough to know that if they were to do something like that, for one, it probably wouldn't even meet with agreement from the Senate. It would be nothing that would ever meet my desk. But if it did, of course, I would just have to veto it, and we would start all over again. We'd be spending December here, maybe January here, maybe February here. And I know one thing about both the House and Senate: they want to get out of here.
Now, we should have set that up a little bit more, but the reference the governor made in there to, if they do something like
Right.
that was actually what they did.
Yeah, what they did.
The question at this time before the vote took place was, if they sent the bill, if they sent this omnibus education bill with the increases in spending without the voucher provision, would he sign it? And you've heard his response to that. But I mean, it was a very interesting kind of sign of, how the governor handles the legislature and in particular the House and the language of that. And that, he's, that was pushy in an almost kind of, in not even an almost, in a kind of personal way. It's like, I know this will make you guys miserable.
Yeah.
You know who I am. You know that I'll push hard against you. And, got a lot of play at the moment, but interestingly enough, it didn't work.
Yeah, and I agree with everything you said, and I add to that also, there's sort of there's an aspect to this, which is, once he said, we're only going to do 2 sessions and then we're going to leave, in some ways he's telling members how long they need to hold out for those who want to hold out.
Right.
And so there is also a little bit of cleanup here strategically, maybe in some ways, to say, well, maybe I will keep calling you back. Maybe I will just make this go on, because in some ways you lose, just from a strategic bargaining standpoint, you lose some bargaining leverage when you basically let them know that there's an end date at which point this is done and their preferences, no vouchers in this case, is achieved. And so I think part of this was strategic also. But I mean, to your point, it's hard not to listen to that clip and even look. When you watch it, it's even better. And see, I don't know a better way to describe it than a smirk.
Yeah.
I mean, when he basically says, look, you have families.
Well, it was great. There was like a smirk in an earlier point in that, and then an outright kind of grin later on. He seemed to be enjoying it. I mean,
yeah. I mean, the thing is,
at
I don't
the
know how
very
much
least comfortable making these threats.
probably enjoyed it more then than he has now, because I mean, ultimately, I said, either as a bank shot, it could say, well, I don't want to say that there's an obvious end date to this. Maybe that wasn't a good idea when I said it. But the other side of it is, it's kind of replaying these similar dynamics where some elected official outside of the House, to be clear, starts telling the House what they should do, how they should do it, when they should do it. And just historically, like this, and especially even on this issue alone, we don't have to say historically, but on this issue alone, that has not moved the ball forward much.
Right. Now, again, I mean, to be fair, I mean, there's a little bit of a teachable moment here. And, whether it worked or not in this instance, I mean, the governor is, has been doing this a while.
Yeah.
And he does know when, have a sense of when his leverage is maximum. Mm-hmm. But, as this infinite, just because you have relative leverage at a certain moment doesn't mean you have infinite leverage. And this is, again, this is a constitutional system in which however much the last couple of governors, this one, the one before, has extended the power of the governor's office, it's still constrained.
Yeah.
Now, we should also say that when this session expires in a few days, the governor could, in fact, call them back.
Yeah.
Now, I think given that nothing on the ground has changed since then, it would be taken as simply a punitive action and one that is less than entirely likely to provide the kind of result he wants. But he could. But for now, the bill did fail.
Right.
Does seem like it's not going anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And we did see, the governor, sort of shifting gears. And again, to be fair, not on this specific issue.
Right.
But he shifted gears by doing other things, and other things, that I would argue, and has a lot more direct political value and a lot less downside. Mm-hmm. So, last weekend, he endorsed Donald Trump for president in a joint appearance at the border in which, Trump and Abbott seemingly doubled down on each other.
Yep.
And what people were, all the discussion of, the governor, to the extent that he was being discussed, particularly in the national press, which was about, well, what does this mean for Abbott? Does this mean he's a vice presidential candidate? Does this mean he's a candidate for the cabinet, et cetera? Now, I think we're both pretty on the record as being skeptical about these things for a lot of different reasons.
Yeah.
But I would also argue that, it hurts him not at all.
Yeah.
For the conversation, for reporters to be calling sources and editors to be assigning reporters stories on, what is Greg Abbott's national potential, that crowd out local media and state level media outlets on, the governor's been defeated on vouchers again.
Yeah, and I think, this is just another, I mean, I would say even, more locally, again, I'm not necessarily interested in the national angle, although it's interesting, obviously. But I mean, from the Texas angle, I mean, the way that I look at this is he just, took another action that sort of shores up his flank against Patrick, who's been Donald Trump's campaign lead in Texas for both of his elections and is really, I mean, I think, there's a lot of reporting about Dan Patrick's relationship with Donald Trump. And so to the extent that Abbott kept, I wouldn't say an arm's length distance, probably like a half an arm length distance or something. I mean,
I would say he's been measured.
He's been measured. I think,
look, to be fair, the governor's representatives would be saying, hey, look, what do you want? The guy, he's traveled to D.C. to appear with the president,
But I wouldn't say this. He hasn't, let me put it this way. I think Abbott has been a little bit more conscious about maintaining his own brand. Maybe as opposed to sort of getting too much into Trump's orbit, which can, you can very easily get subsumed by Trump very quickly. But this to me, was one of the more sort of public facing, clearly meant to like put it out there, get the statewide coverage. Here's me and Donald Trump at the border.
Yeah, both of us talking about, all the stuff that can be done. Former President Trump, as I recall, told Governor Abbott he wouldn't have to spend his own money anymore after this, that, the federal government will be back to the rescue when he gets elected. They both got to pick on Joe Biden.
Right.
Obviously, as we've said on here again and again, the border is a great issue for Republicans for a number of reasons. So, so that happened.
Right. That happened.
In pretty close, pretty short order after the vote, really, within a week or so. Governor took a skydiving trip.
Right.
Also got a lot of press coverage.
Yeah.
And then more recently, he endorsed the opponent of an incumbent House Republican, Hugh Shine.
Mm-hmm.
Which did answer, I think, a lingering question. And I looking back on it, I may have been a little too skeptical of this. I mean, I was really curious, and we'll still see this as one endorsement.
Right.
About just how far out on a limb the governor is going to go with these kinds of endorsements.
Mm-hmm.
And there, but there was a question, would he really want to endorse against incumbents in the GOP primary? Now, in this case, he endorsed Hillary Hickland from Belton against Shine. Shine's, is a legislative veteran, did a term from 86 to 91, and then came back in 2016. We were talking before, hasn't had a lot of trouble holding on to that seat since he's been back.
Right.
Last couple of cycles, no primary challenger, easy general election wins. Now, again, Shine was, not surprisingly, was a vote against educational savings accounts. This is not totally unprecedented.
Right.
Right. So, I mean, I think it's fair. There's been reporting that, dug up, I think, in the Tribune that, this is the first time Abbott is backed a primary opponent to a House Republican since May of 22, when he backed Stan Kitzman, who successfully challenged Phil Stevenson. Before that, he endorsed 3 primary challengers to House Republicans in 2018. He got one of, to the point we were talking about earlier, he got one of 3 in that.
Right.
So he endorsed Mays Middleton against Wayne Faircloth, launched what has been a successful political career thus far for Mays Middleton. But he also endorsed losing primary challengers against Sarah Davis and Lyle Larson. And in terms of thinking about targets, both Sarah Davis and Lyle Larson are now gone.
Right.
Sarah Davis lost in the general election that year, I guess. While Lyle Larson prevailed in that election, he then hung it up after the 2021 session. So both Lyle Larson and Sarah Davis, both of whom were, pretty clearly dissidents, and Lyle Larson in particular was pretty directly critical of the governor.
Yeah.
So, we can just process that, right, in terms of, what kinds of targets he's chosen in the past.
Yeah, well, and the other thing too is, in those cases in the past, at least, thinking back on 2018, I know that he had, sort of specific grievances against some of those members. And
Right.
As I recall, Larson was pushing sort of some accountability measures for the executive branch that I know that the governor clearly did not appreciate.
Yes.
And so those were a little bit more,
Right. Sarah Davis, just for those, that are relatively new to this, although anybody listening to this probably knows, was the only pro-choice Republican in the caucus at the time, and
Right.
very much kind of a maverick.
Yeah, and obviously the fact that district flipped to the Democrats also kind of tells you.
Yeah, and that was a competitive Tony Houston district.
Right. And so, in the past, it sort of seems like, they've been a little bit more idiosyncratic and maybe even personal in nature, these challenges. The question is, okay, so now, he's endorsed one challenger, but the universe we know is bigger, right? Because the universe, I think, we think about here is the 21 Republicans who voted, and at least the 21 Republicans who voted for the amendment that stripped the voucher funding from the omnibus education bill. Maybe, potentially more, although I would start with that group. And so, okay, we're at 1 now. And so, the question kind of becomes what's next in a lot of ways, right? do we want to go into, do we want to talk about them? I've sort of got a couple different thoughts here about the effects of this.
Yeah, let's do that a little bit.
Just stay in this for a second. To my mind, the question I'm getting a lot is, does Abbott call them back for another special session? And the first sort of the argument against it, is, to my perspective, is just that, the more sessions he calls them back that they don't get it done, the less effective he looks. And it doesn't sound crazy, but whoever the next, Huffines avatar is who comes along, who wants to say, listen, he didn't get it done. He wasn't committed on vouchers. I am, right?
Right.
To the effect that he's providing more evidence that he can't alone get it done. And look, I'm not saying that that's a weakness of his. It's just I think in a lot of ways it's the system working itself out. As you said, he only has so much leverage here. And so I think, to call them back more creates more exposure. Similarly, we were talking about this a little bit earlier. It's like, okay, so let's say he, decides to endorse in some number of these 21 cases just as a starting point. And, you say like, maybe he endorses in 5 races, 10 races, maybe in all 21, who knows? And then you sort of have to ask yourself, well, at what level of success, both, winning those primaries and then presumably also winning the general elections, does that make you feel like you're in a strong position and look like
right? Because we should add to that also since the last time we recorded, he endorsed every incumbent that voted for voted against the voucher amendment,
right? Exactly, and so I think
essentially a vote for vouchers.
And so I think and then the question becomes if he gets 2 of 10, 5 of 10, 8 of 10, does he need to get 10 of 10? Let's just say he endorses 10 challengers, and part of this is, the public reaction to it. How does it get written about? Because it's going to get written about in terms of his quote unquote success in whatever you want to say, involving himself in Republican primaries. But from a real practical standpoint, I would think, and maybe I'm wrong here, feel free, anyone, you tell me, but this is where the rubber meets the road if I'm a member thinking about threats from the governor. No doubt this is going to be a pain in the butt for any incumbent that is being challenged here and is where there's an endorsement coming from the governor, because the campaign is already fixed for your challenger. This person voted against the essays. They probably voted to impeach Ken Paxton, and I'm the only candidate endorsed by the governor. I'm not saying that's not something that can be overcome by an incumbent who has, good connections in the district and has a political organization, but it's going to take work and money and a lot more time than maybe, someone like Representative Shine, who faced no primary challengers in the last 2 cycles, really is going to want to put in, but they're going to have to. And so there is a cost here, but I think the ultimate, scoreboard is going to come down to how many of these seats did Abbott flip. At the same time, there's this broader question out here, which is if he were perfectly, bad 100% or 1,000, right? Is he going to really change out a quarter of the Republican caucus? I mean, so that's, there are kind of 2 questions munched in there. I mean, I think, what I would come out of that is saying, look, there's you're balancing the internal game versus the external appearance of it, Internally, as we were saying before, I mean, I think to send the message to House members, you don't have to win those challenges. True.
Those challenges, right? All you have to do is demonstrate that there's, punishment and inconvenience. And as we've said in here a million times, the problem with primary challengers, from the perspective of an individual incumbent candidate, I mean, part of it is your assessment of the threat. But even if the threat is low, relatively low, it's still deeply inconvenient as something that, members would much rather not have a primary opponent, let alone one endorsed by the government, than the governor. So, and I think, if you're the Abbott team, you're balancing that against the kind of thing you mentioned, which is how does this play publicly? And I'm not, it'll be interesting to see how many he takes on and how they sort that out. My guess is, probably where you started, they want to challenge in a few higher probability of success races.
Yeah.
And that's probably sufficient to send the internal message and minimize the external, the risks associated with some negative coverage afterwards, or, an illusion of failure or an impression of failure.
Yeah. I mean, it'll be really interesting, again, we're going to watch this, obviously talk about it more, but, as it plays out, it'll be really interesting to see going forward into, future sessions, how this continues to inform kind of the relationship between the governor and the legislature, because I can see a lot of these members sort of, probably feeling like here I am, doing what I think is representing my district. And here I have, the governor who I share a party with, who has basically unlimited resources, essentially campaigning against me for doing that, you know?
Yeah. And it's that signaling that's, probably most useful to them, but they just have to be aware of what the outer chance, what the outer liabilities are. So, so let's think a little bit about then, we've kind of moved into the primary piece, but I want to backtrack for a second and go back to if we take the odds on bet right now and predict that, the vouchers are dead again for the 4th session and they're probably not going to be resurrected, which I think is a safe-ish bet at this point. Not 100%, but what is?
Yeah.
What do we conclude from this kind of outcome? This outcome of the special session. I mean, the regular session, the 4 special sessions, and even throw in the Paxton impeachment as part of the legislative action in 2023, which was, at least in terms of them being in session, was pretty nonstop. How dysfunctional is this? I mean, I think it's very much in vogue among opponents of the governor and, various, factions of the party, depending on what the subject is, right? To say, things, that the legislature is underperforming, and I think there's 2 different ways, 2 basic ways of framing that. There's a nonpartisan, what did they produce?
Right. Yeah.
What did people want? What did they produce? What did the product look like?
Right.
And, or, the more limited range that is, also disputed. What did Republican voters want? What did Republican elites want?
Yeah.
How does this session look? So I think, we had talked about this at one point in terms of, are things working or not? Like how, what kind of a governance assessment can we make here? And I think, to be very myopic and in the moment.
Okay.
On vouchers, the governor's line, and I think the line of voucher proponents are, look, this is something Republican voters want.
Right.
We've been talking about it for a long time. And the legislature didn't deliver because essentially the House sucks.
Yeah.
Right. In particular, the House leadership, as the critique goes. That's not me speaking. I'm just
with a dash of Democrats and unions.
Right. Channeling the critique. Well, but that's why the House leadership sucks, because they got rolled by the Democrats and the unions. Is
the argument.
The Twitter or the X version of that critique, right? And it doesn't hold. There's something to that, but it's not. But look, there are reasons that figures as powerful even as the governor and the lieutenant governor can't pass this through. And we've talked about this. We've got a decent amount of polling data that shows that, yes, you can get a narrow support, narrow range of public support, put it this way, a narrow margin of public support, sometimes a bare, clean majority, sometimes just a plurality that say they're in favor of ESAs or vouchers.
Right.
We have a good piece on the website if people haven't seen it about, the degree to which that's inflected by language. We did most of a podcast on that a month or so ago, I think. But the data has also demonstrated that this is not an issue that people have, that voters prioritize.
Right.
Either, especially overall, but even within the range of public education issues or education, systemic educational issues.
Right.
And so if you look at, looking at then telescoping out a little bit to the agendas of the special session, what have they done? They've done a lot on border security.
Right.
That, in fact, seems pretty responsive, even if there's a political logic to it that's undeniable.
Yeah, as you're talking about this, I'm just going to throw something in there, thinking about, sort of assessing, basically how the system, quote unquote, is working, right? And you'd mentioned these sort of, different ways we could think about it just from a purely kind of, I don't even know what I would say, sort of input-output with respect to what the public broadly wants. And so we could say
that's why I threw elites in there.
Exactly.
And break it down. And,
and I agree with all that. Sort of the public writ large, versus the output. And then there's sort of, Republican voters specifically in the output. But, in some ways I was thinking as you're talking about that, about, how the process is working. And if you take and just sort of abstract just a little bit, it's like, okay, working in, and I was thinking how, and I was thinking, well, maybe the question is working with respect to processing sort of the politics of the state on the one hand and the policy needs of the state on the other hand, right? And sometimes these things are in alignment and boom, no problem. And like on immigration, border security measures, the politics are in alignment, the policy needs that would address those politics, are in alignment. And so we move forward, right?
I mean, and I just, by in alignment, you're not saying it's necessarily the best policy, but it's prima facie responsive.
Well, I may even say it's even simpler than that. Say, are they in conflict?
Yeah.
And they're not, in conflict with each other, right? Now, when you get to sort of the voucher piece of it, it's like, well, the politics of this are very difficult within, the legislative, and there's policy disagreements. And so it didn't produce an outcome, right?
Right.
And in some ways, you might say to yourself, I would say the system is sort of working as designed. And in some ways, I'd say, just in thinking about this, it's not because the state government and state leadership is not able to come together and make I think for the most part, good faith efforts to try to address policy needs, especially big ones, right? But it's having a hard time dealing with the political conflict internally.
Yeah.
Right.
And I would say that's even evident in the kind of approach that is the legislature and the governor have taken to border security.
Mm-hmm, for sure.
Which is that the biggest fights, over border security, I mean, there's really not much trouble giving the governor extra, another $1.5 billion or so.
Right. It's just
maybe 1.2, 1.5 for border security projects.
Right.
But, the bill that, wound up, fundamentally challenging federal sovereignty over immigration, which is going to wind up in the courts, seems more gestural than substantive at this point.
Yeah.
And that's a function of everybody, the incentive to out border security, whatever the baseline of border security is.
It's never enough.
Right. It's never enough. And we've seen that in terms of our data on spending. And so it's an example of, indirectly, I think, but not very indirectly, of the primacy of the Republican primary in the state and all of the things that are adjacent to that. Republican control of the redistricting process, the whole host of advantages that Republicans have that put the focus on Republican primary voters and the incentives there. Now, we're always careful about that with border security because border security, as we've said again and here multiple times, pretty good general election issue right now because of Democratic and independent attitudes that are, especially independents, but even among a minority, but a non-trivial minority of Democrats, a lot of these policies play okay.
Yeah, and I think to what you were saying before about, we might think about how the health of the system or how functional the government is with respect to, how it's responding to the electorate writ large and to, Republican primary voters and Republicans in particular, given the fact that, control of government. But this is an issue that if you want to take a step back, I mean, I can imagine a reporter from out of state calling me and say, what's up with Texas's obsession, with the border? And even setting aside all those other arguments you made that I totally agree with and we've talked about a lot here. Because whenever we ask what the most important issue facing the state is, it's at the top of the list.
Right.
If the legislature did not do something or try to do something or seem to do something in this direction, I mean, I think people would say,
I guess the argument I'd make here in terms of, the asterisk on this being responsive is that, there is some oversteer here. That's kind of the point about the,
Yeah, absolutely.
Like, because you're, there's an almost manicness to demonstrating, how focused you are on this. And you can say, as we've fed this as much as anybody in terms of being endogenous to this with, the poll results, which have been strikingly consistent. But there is a kind of, there's a warp in the system here.
Right. Well, the conflict as I was
and Texas is not alone in this, obviously.
Well, I think here, before I was thinking about the ability of the system to deal with both political and conflict and policy conflict. Here, there's no political conflict, but there's actually some policy conflict.
Yeah.
In some ways. And part of this, but, most of it kind of gets papered over. And here we actually...
There's no political conflict within the governing coalition. Yeah.
No, there's no political... Yeah, exactly. There's no political conflict within the governing coalition. Here we saw there's some policy... I think I'll say this. It's possible that as time goes on, we start to see more policy conflicts around immigration and border security than we have. This could be sort of a harbinger in the sense that we've seen this, I think, previously, that as the state gets so far down the line on some of these policies and have already taken multiple bites at the apple at whatever it is, it kind of leads to the situation where, as you said, we see dysfunction over...
Start scraping the guardrails.
Yeah, you're scraping... Well, and this is the point. We talked about this before, but why would there be a conflict over a bill that's purely going to go to the courts and be challenged over, its constitutionality, when really the only... argument was are we fingerprinting the people we find? Are we keeping them in county jails? Are we sending them back to the border? You're not doing any of these things because this is going to court.
Right.
But the point is that as you get so far down the line and you're already putting billions of dollars, this is what's left. And this is what's happened in a lot of sort of policy areas where, again, conservative success has actually made more policy conflict. I mean, everybody agrees, we should probably do more here.
Yeah.
But the what becomes harder.
Right. And so... Yeah. So what have we seen? You see two dynamics. One, just spend more money.
Yep. Which,
again, our polling has shown there's a high tolerance for.
Right.
If not even demand.
Demand, yeah.
Right. And look for new and novel ways to call attention to your efforts.
Right. So I mean,
especially as people get used to you spending more money, you need something else more novel, and I think that explains the bill you were talking about.
and I think at the same time, you got to be fair here, right? Like, I mean, I think, and we say this, I've said this a couple times, I'm sure I've said this podcast, but the number of issues that sort of become salient for the electorate is only a tiny, tiny fraction of all of the business that the legislature takes on.
Right.
So when we start looking at, is the legislature somehow fatally flawed, or is the system dysfunctional? It's like, and you just look at vouchers and you just look at the border kind of issue, or just focus on the special sessions, I mean, that's a very, very small universe. And actually, the legislature did a bunch of other stuff.
Right. And look, and I think it's fair to argue that they did accomplish a few things that were in the realm of, less sexy and less liable to generate political reward, with one exception I'll talk about in this category. And that, based on our polling and watching the elite conversation, were important going into the session. I mean, they accomplished infrastructure spending via some constitutional amendments, water, broadband, transportation, notably. Critics could fairly argue that the actions they took were either, too small, which is the common critique of the water bill from people in that policy realm, or they did the wrong thing and may not work, or maybe even counterproductive and costly. And that's, the critique on the grid and energy. But that's also why also contributed to the momentum for those measures to be constitutional amendments for the public to sign off on. And overall, if you look at what the highest priorities overall going into the legislature were, and we have a lot of different measures on this, and we can pick a couple of different things to look at. It looks spottier, but it also looks like, in terms of this macro level question of, what we want from the system.
Right.
I think you could call it, guardedly responsive, allowing for the kinds of things that we often, people often say they want, which is compromise to the end of actually getting something done, rather than, either, approaching this in a binary way. They're saying, if we don't spend, an infinite amount on water, what we really need, then we shouldn't do it at all.
Yeah, right.
Which is, not, very few people would say that.
Right.
But, so in that sense, what do we see here? I mean, we could start in a number of different ways. Look, most broadly, when we gave people an open-ended question in April, and this was early April as things were really finally, kind of substantively getting underway in the legislature, the things people, were most likely to say in that open-ended item that we asked that they wanted: 22% in immigration and border security, 11% gun control, gun safety, 7% each on, acting in the general areas of education and inflation, the cost of living.
Mm-hmm.
And, so, immigration and border security, no surprise.
Right.
Gun control and gun safety, that was mostly Democrats.
But again, there's a lot of attention to that during the legislative session. Democrats brought a lot of attention to it. Senator Gutierrez brought a lot of attention to it. I mean, and people would point out that, the bill to raise the age to purchase a semi-automatic firearm from 18 to 21 made it the farthest,
Actually
any bill that would have restricted gun rights
it got out of committee.
So,
and it was moribund, but there was a lot of discussion of education.
Huge education. I mean, again, we focus at the end on vouchers, but there's a huge education agenda. And when we just say education, remember, this is split. There's some Democrats, some Republicans. Some of this stuff was definitely addressed more than others. And so, yes.
Right. Okay, now if we get a little more detailed, in that same poll, we gave people a really long list of things that we asked them to assess the importance of, that we knew was being discussed. At the time we wrote this battery, we looked at the bills that had been introduced, some of the stuff that was moving and not moving. Right. We looked at the public debate. So we put a lot of thought in this, and
also what voters told us in the prior polls.
And what they had told us in prior poll. That's right. And so, without going into like the numbers, if you look at there were 4 items that were either in the high 60s or higher. Mm-hmm. In terms of the share of Texans overall, registered voters, that said it was either extremely important or very important for the legislature to accomplish. Top response: improve the viability of the state's energy grid, reduce property taxes, increase funding for school safety, improve the reliability of the state's water supply.
Yep. And at least 40% of voters for each of those said it was extremely important for the legislature to do
So,
this.
I think that's a fair, look at what people thought, they wanted done. And we should just say, given what we've already said, bubbling right below that at 37% extremely important and just 59% saying very important was increasing funding for border security operations.
Right.
So, and then, something else close to that at 63, increased funding for the public school system.
And so this, yeah.
So if you look at all of those things, on improving the reliability of the grid, they did something.
They tried.
And they spent a lot of time on it.
Yep.
It's been fundamentally critiqued because it's seen as focusing too much on channeling money to conventional,
right,
carbon sources of energy. Nonetheless, they did something. Reduced property taxes.
Yeah.
They acted on that. It took them, it was ugly. Took them a special session to do it.
Right.
But they did it. Increased funding for school safety.
They did.
They did that. Now.
They tried to do more.
And it got ugly pretty quickly because as soon as, no sooner had they passed it than school districts were reporting.
Well, right.
Having to move money around to pay for security and who was going to qualify. And there were all kinds of.
As far as the way that this question was phrased, they did increase funding for school safety.
Right.
Did they do it enough? And also the other piece of this is, did they do it enough to pay for the armed guards that all the school districts are supposed to be now paying for out of their budgets? Right. That's a other question. But,
right. And the answer to that appears to be no. But,
right.
And that was, they were trying to address that actually in part in the special session.
Right.
After that, the fourth thing, improve the reliability of the state's water supply.
Made an effort there.
Acted on that, made an effort. And then we said increase funding for the public education system. Now on that.
But border security first, which they did.
Border security before that, which they did.
In spades.
And then increasing, increasing reliability of the water, of
the funding
for the public education system. And, they didn't do that.
Right. But I'll just say right now, that wasn't a priority of Republicans.
Right. And they were, and even given that, it got in the mix.
Yeah.
Again, not very much and roundly kind of drubbed. And so, we could go further down that list and there's, as you get further down, you get more, mixed, particularly as you get to priorities, as you kind of imply there, where we got, in the range of, more than 50% support. A lot of those were driven primarily by Democrats.
Yeah, or some Republicans. I think the point,
and a plural, and maybe smaller pluralities of Republicans.
Well, I'll say and again, without going through every item on the list, one of the things that I think kind of separates the things that bubbled to the top versus the things that had less perceived importance were in a lot of ways systemic concerns at the top, right? Energy, water, school safety, the border security, property taxes, right? I mean, these things, there's things that more or less impact everybody in every community, whether directly or indirectly. As we go down the list, we've seen, more targeted policies, either, Democratic priorities or, policies that are important to Republican primary voters or very engaged actors. And those are further down the list. But I think the overall point here is, in some ways, and maybe I'm just realizing this as we talk about, kind of a responsive session,
Well,
you get locked up in the, if you just sort of say, well, let's just forget about everything that happened before June, you'd say, boy, it's been a real mess. These guys can't, seem to agree on anything. At the same time, when you go back and you look at, the start of the session, you look at what voters were talking about, you look how the agenda formed, what voters' reactions were to the agenda and what they ultimately accomplished. They're not walking away, necessarily with their heads, their heads in their hands, hiding themselves from the voters and saying, we didn't, address the big needs here. And this is really this is the general election issues. These are the issues that they're going to point to and say, we made historic investments in the border. We made historic investments in the state's infrastructure. We're going to, for water, for transportation, for energy, for broadband. We reduced your property taxes. Doesn't sound that complicated.
No. And so what's interesting, I think, about this, to tie this together, and I think we were going to talk more about the primaries, but let's do that next time.
Okay.
But to set the stage for that, as a teaser, I think this does connect to the discussion we had a few minutes ago about primary challengers and what the primary is going to look like. Because if you think about all these things that we're talking about, it's not as if incumbent Republicans are not going to have a lot to talk about.
Yeah, for sure.
Right. And so to go back to your sort of TV ad,
Right.
if the opponents are running negative ads that are saying, this Republican incumbent is not a real Republican because he voted against vouchers and he voted to impeach Attorney General Paxton, who's everybody's hero.
Right.
A lot to unpack there, and I did want to talk about that this week, but we'll hang on to that. There's time. On the other hand, if you're the incumbent, this is a pretty good list of things.
Yeah, it is.
We added billions more to border security and beefed up the ability of police and Texas National Guard to shore up the failings of socialist Joe Biden.
Mm-hmm.
We cut your property taxes,
Yep.
And so on. I mean, this is not a crappy list, even if you're running in a primary. As you say, I think it's a pretty good general election list too, even though it's presidential election year. If you're going to differentiate yourself from that, or and that'll be a calculation to be made
right
a universe away from now in political time. But looking at this list, it's a pretty good list of things to run on if you can focus voters' attentions on that. And that, I think, then, and we'll re-raise this when it comes time to talk about the primaries. But if you've got the money to promote that message in your district, and you've got a pretty good foundation in your district already, if you're not in trouble going in,
right,
I think your incumbent, the advantage of incumbency is pretty good.
Yeah, I think so too. I also think, something that people kind of keep, just mentioning is this. You worry about the outside. You don't worry. You think about the outside influences in these races. If you're an incumbent, you think about it. You worry about the outside influences. But again, this is going to be a presidential election year.
Yeah.
There are a lot of races and a lot of money that needs to be spent in a lot of different places. And the idea, to my mind, that there's going to be a ton of outside influence coming into these primaries beyond what we're already talking about here. And honestly, the regular players in it, right. I think that's pretty unlikely.
Yeah. Again, we'll move to the primary thing later, but it's going to be a broader field of competition. We had some numbers for that. There are more, there's an uptick, a couple of weeks still before the filing deadline,
December 11th,
in the number of primary opponents that, have filed on the Republican side.
Yeah.
But that doesn't guarantee victory. It just guarantees more fighting and more money flowing into these races.
Yeah, we'll talk about, again, we will definitely talk about this more next week. But the thing that I'm sort of wondering about here, and this ties this all together too in some ways, is, does the increase in primary challengers reflect an increase in dissatisfaction on the ground with the output of the legislature? Because on the one hand, as we've talked about, I don't know that that's necessarily reasonable. Or does it reflect, in a lot of ways, not the inability, but the messiness with which the process has dealt with internal political conflict.
Right.
And how salient is that internal political conflict for Republican primary voters first and foremost? And that's sort of the question that we're going to kind of see, I think, uncovering an answer at least over the next, few months.
For now, we breathlessly await the formal end of the fourth special session.
And the filing deadline.
For the primaries. But especially right now, just seeing how this, we're looking at ending with a whimper rather than a bang is the predominant feeling. But, the governor will have something to say about this, and, we'll see if anybody pulls a rabbit out of their hat. But until then, thanks to Josh for being here. Thank you for listening to the podcast above all. And of course, thanks again to our excellent production team in the Dev Studio in the College of Liberal Arts at UT Austin. We'll post this podcast. If you're listening to this on a podcasting platform, there'll be a post of this podcast with some of the polling that we've talked about and links to results, since we referenced some things from some polling earlier in the year. So thanks again for listening, and we'll be back soon with another Second Reading podcast. The Second Reading podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.